Few words. The really biggest loser are the tax bill and the sick people. There are going to be a lot of people that's going to die because of this sick tax bill. Nobody seems to care. And there are no winners. To me, there are no winners. And also, I have one thing else to say. I said, let God be the judge and not the Republican. Most of the Republicans are not even saved. Some of them are. But let God be the judge of all of us. He said he was come back and judge the world. Thank you.
Skip, Valley Springs, California, line for independence. Last call in this segment. Who's your political winner and loser of 2017?
I think the losers are the American people. I'm really starting to wonder, has anybody ever recently read the Constitution of the United States? Have they ever looked at the Declaration of Independence? Because it's like, I'm just appalled at how many people call it and show their complete ignorance of what our country's all about. And the Constitution is what describes what we're all about. And I think Trump is just stomping on the Constitution. He's just continually, I mean, the First Amendment, the very First Amendment, the one that was most important to this country was freedom of the press. And here he is calling the press the enemy of the people? I mean, come on, people. And you Skip, can't support a person like that.
Before we go, Skip, do you have a political winner of the year?
There are no winners. There are none. I mean, there's only losers in this country right now because we're all being hurt by this.
That's Skip in California, our last caller in this segment, but we're going to return to this question again in our last hour of the Washington Journal from 9 to 10 this morning. But up next, our Washington Journal Authors Series continues. Today, Haroon Ullah joins us to discuss his book, Digital World War, Islamists, Extremists, and the Fight for Cyber Supremacy. That's all coming up in just a minute on the Washington Journal.
Coming up New Year's weekend on C-SPAN, Saturday at 8 p.m. Eastern. North Korean refugees describe life under the Kim regime.
In China, however, tens of thousands of North Korean defectors are living without papers, under the shadows, and are being physically or sexually exploited. While the U.S. should continue urging China and Russia to support more economic sanctions, it should also do more to stop Beijing repatriating defectors back to North Korea.
Sunday at 6:30 p.m. Eastern, James Clapper on his career in the intelligence community.
We call that new paradigm immaculate collection. Now, I mean it semi-humorously, but it makes a point about the difficulty of being so precise, given the global interconnection represented by the internet, which is where everybody communicates, and the difficulty of sorting out, good people and bad people.
And on Monday, New Year's Day at 10 a.m. Eastern, a Tech Fire Summit on the self-driving revolution. And at noon, former Clinton administration officials on the legacy of President Bill Clinton.
He knew who he was fighting for. He got there every day. He knew the people he wanted to help. And through thick and thin, when times were good and times were bad, all he cared about was could he deliver for the people who needed the government to be on their side.
Watch this New Year's weekend on C-SPAN.
C-SPAN's Student Cam. The tweets say it all. Student Cam in action. Video editing and splicing for constitutional documentaries. This group showed us how it's done. 2 stellar interviews in one day. And these students asked some hard-hitting questions about immigration reform and the DREAM Act. We're asking students to choose a provision of the U.S. Constitution and create a video illustrating why it's important. Our competition is open to all middle school and high school students, grades 6 through 12. $100,000 in cash prizes will be awarded. The grand prize of $5,000 will go to the student or team with the best overall entry. The deadline is January 18th. Get contest details on our website at studentcam.org. Washington Journal continues.
And we continue our Washington Journal Authors Series today, welcoming Haroon Ullah. His book was published in October. It's called The Digital World War, Islamists, Extremists, and the Fight for Digital Supremacy. And Dr. Ullah, before we get into the fight for that digital battlefield, first define some terms for us, especially the very important distinction that you make in the title and throughout the book between Islamists and extremists.
Yeah, absolutely. And thanks for having me. I'm thrilled to be here and talk to you about something I'm really passionate about. I think the definitions actually are really important. Part of it is that I think Islamists, I like to think of them, when you distinguish it from extremists, you look on a couple different dimensions. You look at it, do they play by the rules of the game? What do they say publicly about the Constitution? Do they use extra electoral means when they're trying to win votes or when they're trying to run for office? And the big one is, do they use violence? Do they think violence is a legitimate way in terms of communicating and achieving their goals? And I think when you look at those markers, you'll find by and large, the way I think of Islamists as a group that has a foundation in sort of religious orthodoxy, but plays within the rules of the game, within the current mandate. And extremists have a very different aim, and they want to use extra electoral means, they want to use violence, because their aims are very different.
So how do Islamists use the digital battlefield here, and how do extremists use it? What are the goals of both of these kind of groups? And I know it's a spectrum that you talk about throughout your book.
Well, let's take Islamists first. So they're interested obviously in audience segmentation, and what they're trying to do is, oftentimes they've been historically not as influential, so they see this information battlefield as a new arena, one to recruit people, to raise money for the political party, to sort of, they think of them sometimes in a pan, like let's say a group in the Middle East, they may see a pan-Arab identity, so they want to recruit people where there's no borders for support for their political party. Extremists are different. Extremists, and I think of extremists now as they use things like black swan incidents, because for them, the return on investment for doing a big terrorist attack or a suicide bombing is just exponential, right? ISIS is getting a lot of free media when they're doing these beheading videos, when they're producing Game of Thrones type apps for young people. So their audience is, for on their end, a very low investment, they're able to get, put themselves on the map.
You mentioned ISIS. Has ISIS proven to be the best at using the tools on this digital battlefield?
They have. I mean, if you think of sort of Taliban as maybe like in elementary school and Al-Qaeda as in middle school, well, ISIS is in college. And so they've taken to the next level. They've built an ecosystem of fanboys. They think carefully about, the different ways they can communicate their message. And at the end of the day, I think this is a content war. And this is why this information battlefield, which is, I think, not as well understood. We kind of know about social media. We use social media, but I'm talking about a whole spectrum: social media, deep web, dark web, and they perfected a way of how to reach people in a way that's sophisticated, and with the mantra: the narrower the audience, the bigger the impact.
And I want to explain that a little bit by talking about some of the specific platforms that you go into in your book, and how these groups use different platforms in different ways, whether it be Twitter or Facebook or YouTube or some of these more dark web spaces. But let's start with Twitter. How do the extremists, how do Islamists use Twitter, and what is their goal on Twitter? Right. So I think Twitter is interesting because they're able to use bots, right? And so they use a lot of like sort of computational tactics. So they have, what they're trying to do is amplify their message. They're trying to get folks out there, they'll put up something that they know will violate Twitter's terms of service. It'll get taken off. They'll get taken off by Twitter, but then they just regenerate, right? So part of it is, how can we do that? The other way they use it, actually, interestingly enough, is they'll have some of their key influencers put out things that don't cross the terms of service. So on Twitter, they'll have people like Mohammed al-Arafi, who is the #1 person on Twitter, an extremist leader, religious leader based in Saudi Arabia. He'll do things where he puts a picture of a bushel of apples, and he'll say the caliphate is bountiful. Well, does that violate the terms of service?
It doesn't on Twitter necessarily. It's not that he's advocating anything violent per se. It's not like he's putting a like around a black flag of ISIS. So they do things where they'll come up to the edge, and then they know that they'll reach one audience on Twitter, and then they'll move them to a more encrypted or end-to-end encrypted app, whether it's like WhatsApp or Telegram or something else. And so they have a whole range of how to reach people.
So go to Facebook, and is it a different tactic and strategy that's being employed on Facebook?
Yeah, I think on Facebook what they'll oftentimes do is they're looking for, Facebook is great for them in terms of how they can see where they can get the likes, and they can see where they might be able to get people that are sympathetic, that engage with them in discussions, right? So it's like finding the needle in the haystack of somebody that's sort of reaching out, somebody that's a fence sitter that might be interested in some of the content. They might see somebody who likes something that seemingly is pro-ISIS. And so for them, it's really about targeting. And I think that's where Facebook is really important. Twitter's about amplification. Facebook's about targeting.
And YouTube is another social media platform you talk a lot about in your book.
Yeah, YouTube is where they can visually tell the narrative. And they know that even if their videos get taken down, they can regenerate, or those videos can be put on other places. It's a great way. You know, they do everything from 2-minute highlight reel clips to raw, authentic video from like kind of person on the street type video. But they're really attuned to this idea of visually telling the narrative, because they know that for a lot of the young people that they're trying to reach out to, you know, they're not going to sit there and read a 100-page book, but they are going to watch a 3-minute video.
Haroon Ullah is the author of the book Digital World War, Islamists, Extremists, and the Fight for Cyber Supremacy. And that's the topic until 9 o'clock on the Washington Journal. I invite our viewers to call in with your questions and comments. Republicans, it's 202-748-8001. Democrats, 202-748-8000. Independents, 202-748-8002. Haroon Ullah, how long have you been studying this digital battlefield that we're going to be talking about this morning?
Quite a while, probably a little too long in some ways. But, you know, I've done this for me, what was interesting was that I always thought about what drives young people toward extremism. You know, I grew up in rural America, and I grew up in a small town, and I grew up intellectually curious, because people would ask me, they'd see me, and they say, Haroon, and they look at me, and they're like, what's going on in the Middle East? And I would say, I don't know. They're like, well, tell us, explain to us what's going on in Iraq. I was like, I don't know. I drive a truck. I play tennis and baseball, and I don't know. I have no idea. But that planted a seed in me, because I wanted to go abroad and make sense of what's going on in Iraq, what's going on in Pakistan. You know, but people say is maybe the most dangerous place in the world. These are black boxes for people, almost like the way we thought about Soviet Union, 50 years ago. And so I went abroad, and a lot of times what I did is I went into camps. I went into Taliban and Al-Qaeda camps. And I would ask young people, what made you join? What drove you to this point? Tell me your journey of how to get here. Because from my understanding, first we need to understand what's going on in this dynamic if we want to counter the dynamic. And so often I think we miss out on that first part, and we jump to because really my goal as a policy practitioner, I don't want to just write about this. I want to solve this. I want to put together a Manhattan-like project to mobilize people, because I met thousands of young Malalas. I met hundreds of religious leaders on the front lines fighting against this scourge. How do we mobilize all these pieces? And that's what I talk about in the book.
How did you make it into those camps? Who were you working for at that time? What was sort of the entree to get in?
So I was doing my doctoral work, and I was a student. And interestingly enough, not many people go in that area, because actually most Americans, there's restrictions on getting in those areas. I took the chance to try to get into the northern areas of Pakistan, and I came to them as almost like a journalist, saying, look, explain to me why you're doing what you're doing. And by the way, they wanted to talk, because no one ever asked them that question because of the danger and because of what they represent. And so I was able to get access. I mean, I was lucky in terms of, in that area of Pakistan or Afghanistan, you have to have a political family. It's a very feudal system. And so if you don't have that, then you're in big trouble. But I had people that looked out for me and that believed in my aim. And so I was able to interview them and build relationships in terms of in civil society in the main cities. Because again, in my earlier book, that's what I talked about, vying for Allah's vote, and which led to this book is, how do we explain that idea? How do we explain the mentality? How do we explain almost like a customer journey? How do you explain a young person's journey? And
your work eventually led you to a job in the Trump administration in the State Department under Secretary Tillerson. Mm-hmm. You recently left, but what was your role there?
I worked on the Secretary's policy planning staff, on his staff, and we produced white papers. We try to coordinate national security. We try to think about ways of how do we tackle some of the main key issues facing U.S. national security.
And your job now is at the Broadcasting Board of Governors. What is that?
Yeah, so I'm thrilled. It's Broadcasting Board of Governors, an $800 million global media agency, Voice of America, Radio Free Europe, Office of Cuba Broadcasting, Middle East Broadcasting Network, Radio Free Asia. I mean, it's really an amazing platform, producing over 7,000 hours of broadcasts a day in 71 languages, original content. And, for me, the stories that the Broadcasting Board of Governors is telling is critical, not just to U.S. national security, but telling America's story and reaching audiences all over the world. And so my goal is, how can we double that audience? How can we be even more effective as we go forward?
And Haroon Ullah is with us for the next 45 minutes on the Washington Journal, taking your questions and comments as we talk about the digital world war. That's the title of his book, Islamists, Extremists, and the Fight for Cyber Supremacy. Phone lines again, Republicans, it's 202-748-8001. Democrats, 202-748-8000. Independents, 202-748-8002. You can start calling in like Tom did from Florida on our line for Democrats. Tom, good morning to you.
I wish you could elaborate on the use of bots. It seems like 60 Minutes touched on it, and they're actually putting a purchase price of somewhere around $58,000. Nobody seems to talk about bots, and I wish you could elaborate on it a tad bit.
Tom, that's a great question. Look, computational tactics are they're a big piece of this. In fact, I had a piece that came out yesterday in Vanity Fair, which looked at ISIS 3.0 and looked at the role of Silicon Valley and bots in terms on this information battlefield. And we find that ISIS early on, and I talk early on in 2014, started using computational tactics, started using bots, because for them, one, it's cheap, it scales up pretty exponentially, and in a lot of ways they're able to reach kind of an amplification and resonance in a way that they normally wouldn't. And even that back then, some of the companies like Twitter and Facebook were a little slower. They didn't have the teams to take them off the internet. So their ability to sort of live on and able to sort of gain traction was much higher. So they continue to use bots. Now the sophistication in bots, they've learned from the Russians and what happened to the elections last year. And so they continue to use those tactics because they're able to reach key audiences in urban areas.
Explain ISIS 3.0. It's the subject of your Vanity Fair story.
Well, it's, the way I thought about it was, look, in early 2014, most people were caught off guard by the rise of ISIS. We were still talking about Al-Qaeda, we were talking about Taliban, and all of a sudden, there were a few people, and the people that noticed ISIS were the web operators, people that saw stuff online. They started seeing virtual beheadings. And then it took a long time for the international community and government, civil society to mobilize against them. And so in my head, it was like, okay, so we're talking 3-4 years later. What is the next on the horizon? Yes, we see pictures from Raqqa and Mosul, and people want to say mission accomplished, but it's not yet mission accomplished because ISIS is continuing to adapt. But even more than that, what is the next around the corner? What is the next iteration? Like when we thought of Al-Qaeda, we were thinking of like cameras in caves. And then ISIS came along. Well, what's the next iteration? And we are seeing that next iteration. It's called Tahrir al-Sham. Whether they now have the staying power or not is a different issue. But there are almost like I think of them as a cloud caliphate. They are almost thinking about this information battlefield in a very unique way. And they're using crowdsourcing to recruit people. They're using Bitcoin oftentimes to sort of raise money. This is sort of the new iteration, and they're thinking about extremism on a different level.
Cloud caliphate. So they're not as interested in creating a physical caliphate that they would have to then defend physical space.
That's right. Absolutely. They're almost exclusively in this sort of virtual space. You don't have to travel anywhere. You can stay where you are. And so it's a very different approach. And now they're realizing there may be a whole suite of things that they can do, whether it's shut down electric grids or stealing intellectual property or things that have dramatic effect more than just sort of low-tech bombings. And so to me, it's like, how do we, as a U.S. government, as civil society, as the international community, mobilize? Because we have the best thinkers in Silicon Valley. We have the best tech people. We have the best military. We have the best, there's young people all around the world that are hungry to get on the front lines of this. But what we have is a collective action issue. well, how do we put all these pieces together? And that's why I advocate in my book and in the article for a new Manhattan Project. We have to have that type of urgency.
To Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, James is waiting. Line for Independence. James, good morning.
Hey, God bless you, gentlemen, and God bless being a human being. My name is James. I don't think there's a politician out there better than me, but I'm not going to get there. I'm independent. You know how hard it's getting together? My thing is, why? Why are these kids, why are we still wanting to blow each other up? Why are these kids, young kids wanting to commit suicide, putting on breast and blowing themselves? These are children. Why? What is so wrong in the world right now that people feel so depressed, so mad, and that they want to kill themselves? Why can't we get together? I mean, what is wrong? You think President Trump's cool? He's out there golfing. You think him and Mr. Bone Spurs? You think Mr. Bone Spurs is a good president?
Well, James, we got your question. The why is what James wanted to know.
Yeah, and that's a key question, and it's been a subject of my own research. Look, the why part of it is identity grievances. These young people grow up, they see a system around them that doesn't change. Let's say in the Middle East, they grow up with dictators. They grow up seeing a failed Arab revolution, and they want to do something. And so, oftentimes, like for example, a lot of young people, and some of my work that I did was interviewing defectors. I want to understand, why is it young people why'd they go to ISIS? And I interviewed them all around the world. And I wanted to ask them, what was it about their propaganda that attracted them? And what I realized is that for young people, a lot of them went with altruistic aims. They said, we wanted to get rid of Bashar al-Assad. I think everybody mostly agrees on that. But what happens, they got sucked in, and by the time they got there, it was too late. And so they have these identity grievances. There's a lot of dictators in the region, and they feel like, if I play by the rules of the game, it's not going to work. I have to go this other route. And so they oftentimes are not very religious at all. They're not appealing to that idea. They are just, a lot of them have criminal backgrounds, have mental health issues, but they get recruited because they want to try to do something. And to me, the idea is, these vulnerable youth, we have to provide them with a positive alternative narrative. And that's key to the Manhattan Project.
If a vulnerable youth can find their way to an ISIS recruiter, why can't the United States government shut down those avenues?
Well, part of it is it's hard to find oftentimes, right? They oftentimes are communicating within encrypted platforms. They're communicating on things that it's very difficult to get access to. And a lot of these groups are now using coded language. So they'll use things like kittens and Nutella, two of my favorite things. They're almost like gangs. Like you'll find gangs here in urban areas. They're using color-coded things. They're using other visual-coded things. So it's not easy always to identify. But to me, the key is that it's almost like a see something, say something, that there is, the same ways you think about child pornography and the same ways we think about identifying diseases, we have to have a new approach, almost like a public health approach, to sort of thinking about getting leaders on the front lines. Because oftentimes, I make a point that all radicalization is local. And so if you look at it, you start seeing patterns. So like, for example, in Tunisia, 80% of foreign fighters come from one small neighborhood in Tunis. So when you look at the same thing in Molenbeek in Belgium, so you start looking at these patterns and you say, wait a minute, this is not everybody's a potential extremist. It's actually a very small sliver, but it's coming from one area, and it may be a charismatic leader. It may be that there's a chain of people being recruited. So to me, that's the key, and that's a more effective approach.
To John in Avon, Connecticut, line for Democrats. John, you're on with Haroon Ullah.
Thank you so much. Yes, I do have a question regarding viruses on websites. Now, a lot of these viruses can come from clickbait. They can come from downloads, but I would look like these clickbait advertisements. My biggest question is, do you think these will change? Because, I want to believe that I've been randomly selected to win 2 free iPod Nanos. I want to believe that I'm the 999,999th visitor on this website. I want to believe that there are hot, sexy singles dying to meet me. So my biggest question is, do you think this stuff will change? Do you think there will be viruses out there?
So you bring up an important point, which is that, the clickbait attracts people for a variety of different reasons, some of what you mentioned. And I actually think there's something being pioneered by Google and some other folks called the redirect method. And what it is it's using this idea of clickbait to identify vulnerable youth. So what happens is that when I Google search something about Syria, or I Google something about, identity grievances, on the right-hand side, there'll come up ads, right? And those ads can be targeted because you can actually see what people are searching for. Maybe I'll Google, how do I buy a ticket to go to Syria? And you can start the ads on the right-hand side. You can make them, this redirect method makes it so that people that think that that is speaking to them, some of those ads. And when they click on it, it leads them down a path to give them information. In a lot of ways, information that they're seeking, that can actually move them away, saying, look, ISIS is not what you thought it was. The caliphate is not what you think it was. It's not this, Club Med for foreign fighters. But here's another way that if you want to do something productive, here's another route that's like a Peace Corps or something that's productive, because young people don't want to be told no. They want to do something. They have a lot of energy.
Another part of your book focuses on the history of this digital battlefield. One quote from your book: in every country in which they have a presence, the Islamists have proven more adept at using social media than established governments, and indeed almost all other politically active forces, crippling ruling parties first in the court of public opinion and then on election day. Why are they better at it? Why were they the first ones to be better at it in those areas?
So part of it is because they had first mover advantage. And that is that they had to go underground because there were no public forums to sort of talk, to congregate. They were banned or they were censored. So they had early on to look for ways, using cassette tapes, using other means of going underground, because they were afraid of state-sponsored violence. So they were able to sort of pioneer certain things on the internet before others were, because it was about survival.
You mentioned cassette tapes. Talk about the history of cassette tapes, specifically with the Iranian Revolution.
Yeah, so cassette tapes play a huge role, oftentimes of spreading the message, whether it was Ayatollah Khomeini or other leaders, because, as many people know, Ayatollah Khomeini was abroad and exiled in Europe for most of the time. And so how do you get lectures that he was giving to people that were hungry for this content? And it literally was a whole system of basically, cassette tapes, traveling in suitcases and carry-on baggage, and people taking it all over and making copies in their basements. And that was how, and then people congregating in someone's basement to listen to these lectures. And that's how, early on, that was how communication traveled and how these lectures motivated and mobilized people. Now, if you think about, almost 50, 60 years later, the information battlefield is so much wider, and that's why this platform is so easy for them to use.
Lewis is in Pikesville, Maryland, line for Independence. Good morning.
Yes, I think the whole answer is common sense. Mr. Ullah, Dr. Ullah, you interviewed those students in the areas, but the Americans need to hear some of these students' answers, and this is what I mean. You need to substitute the word to radicalize to just pissed off. Mm-hmm. These kids have seen their villages destroyed, their homes, their aunts, their uncles, their fathers and mothers destroyed, and their leaders decapitated. If you keep decapitating the leaders, you have no one to talk to, and they see a desperation. You just killed. It's like somebody in Philadelphia in 1776. The British came in with special forces and killed off George Washington, Thomas Jefferson, James Madison, Benjamin Franklin. So they had no leaders to negotiate a revolution of freedom. So I think you need to substitute the word radicalized and just put the word pissed off in there. They're just tired. And, these people will die for their cause. And when's the last time you heard someone say they'll die for Jesus? You see? So these people, if anytime you can't threaten a man with death, he is a dangerous enemy. So use some common sense and let us hear some of the answers these students have.
Got your point, Lewis. Dr. Ullah.
Yes, so look, Lewis, you're exactly right about defectors' stories are so powerful. Oftentimes when I would speak to defectors, one of the first questions I asked them was, in one word, describe ISIS to me. And in my mind, I'm thinking they're going to say something like dangerous or horrid or horrible or dark or, blasphemy. But they would say words to me like trust, belonging, identity. And I was like, talking to them in Arabic or in Urdu, and I'm like, almost like there's a disconnect. How could they think that? And part of it was I started to listen to their narratives and what is the propaganda that they're reading, and what is it that they're consuming. And what I realized is defectors need to be on the front lines. Their stories are very powerful, and I take a data-driven approach. I did my doctor work in this, is that defector stories are one of the most powerful antidotes to get their stories out to young people. And it's important to understand their grievances, because if we're going to tackle this scourge and this problem, that's the first step.
What is the Flames of War video series?
So that's a sort of whole suite of almost like a Game of Thrones type of video series, where extremist groups are smart, and they're realizing that, look, we can't reach out to young people with 140-page books anymore, but we need to reach out to them that's something that's visually interesting, that's entertainment, that's drama, because for a lot of young people, they're coming out of video game generation, so they're playing video games, and they want to see, a lot of it, it's machismo, adrenaline filled, and they want to see something that really kind of gets them excited.
I want to show some viewers this from the Daily Mail. It focuses on ISIS propaganda posters, some of their recent propaganda pieces targeting attacks in the West in the New Year's. And I wonder if you're seeing the same thing in the visual cues that they're giving out in these pieces talking about attacking the West. I don't know if you could see it in your screen there, but I know you've seen this series as well.
Yeah, look, the thing is that, and you can see from this, that they're doing things that are visually provocative. They're doing things that they know that this is the meme generation. They're reaching out to Gen Y and Gen Z and these millennials. And so what they're doing is they're doing things that are planting these seeds for young people that have identity grievances or are vulnerable. And that's why I think it's so key. And when I talk about this Manhattan Project, we have so many people on the sidelines ready to fight against this. I mean, we have religious leaders all over the world, here in the U.S. and around the world. We have thousands of young Malalas, and I talk about this in the book called the 1-9-90 model. On social media, my research shows that 1% of people are content creators, are key influencers. 9% share content, and 90% are passive consumers. People like me and you we need to get more people off that 90% into that front lines of the battle, because those stories are organic, articulate, and they can turn the tide.
Speaking of threats during the holidays and the New Year's, this story in today's New York Times, I should point out, the event in Times Square, the ball dropping in Times Square, has long drawn heavy security. But this year, the police said that they would send rooftop observation teams, counter snipers into more buildings. Officers will be patrolling hotels in the days leading up to the ball drop on New Year's. And for the first time, the police department is planning to attach reflective markers to the outside of buildings at certain intervals, so that in the event of an attack, officers can quickly figure out what floor a gunman is on, quoting James O'Neill, the New York City Police Commissioner, saying that there's no direct, credible threats to New York City, to Times Square specifically, or to any of our New Year's events generally. He said, out of an abundance of caution, however, you'll see a stronger police presence out there than we've seen in recent years. We've got about a half hour left in this segment of the Washington Journal. We're talking with Haroon Ullah about his book, Digital World War, Islamists, Extremists, and the Fight for Cybersecurity, inviting viewers to call in, ask your questions as well. Bill called in from Mount Airy, Maryland, a Republican. Bill, go ahead.
Hey, good morning.
Morning,
I
Bill.
wanted to ask, does the war, do you look at that as more of a means of suppressing or cutting off the message, or by countering the message and saying, showing how they're losing the war, or that they will not win, or, there's a better way to go? And how do you measure success in this war?
Bill, fantastic questions. So I'll take the tackle the first one. Look, we have to think about what they've done on the physical battlefield is they've set up a David and Goliath narrative. So even if they lose on the physical battlefield, they're able to win on the information battlefield. And they're able to sort of spin that in a way that supports them. So we have to think broader than just the war. The war is, the war, and God bless our military and our folks on the front lines. They're doing their job. But the problem is that, what we're finding is that in the virtual caliphate, in the virtual sphere, they're able to build on these identity grievances. And this is the other thing. They want a war with the West. They want a civilizational war. And so I think it's very important not to buy into the rhetoric of feeding into what they want. They actually want that because that legitimizes their viewpoints. And so I think it's very important to understand that we have to present alternative, positive pathways for these young people. And that what I've, in my work, and this gets to your second question, Bill, is that, tit for tat messaging doesn't work. So what I say is that there's something called backfire effect. So like if somebody's telling me the caliphate is bountiful, and I'm like, no, the caliphate's not bountiful, what I oftentimes have in that sort of tit for tat is I'm reinforcing someone's predisposed belief. And they actually become stronger, saying, yes, of course the cows are bountiful. He's trying to tell me something different. So
does it matter who that messenger is? If it's the United States government saying that it's not bountiful versus somebody who's left ISIS?
So that's why defector narratives are very important, because they have credibility. They'd be like, I was just like you. I had those same identity grievances, but let me tell you why this path doesn't work. So messengers are important, but it's not just messengers, it's also about content. This is a content wars. And I believe in, a lot of people say, well, U.S. government produced content doesn't work. Well, I'll tell you, bad content doesn't work, whether it's produced by anybody. If you have good content, even produced by the U.S. government, which does produce good content, that can be effective. So we have to think about this in sort of a way that's almost like in terms of a content war, in terms of things that are media savvy, in terms of, I'll tell you what, in the Middle East last year, a lot of people don't know, the #1 rated drama was a drama called Selfie. And this drama is basically making fun of ISIS. And it's a comedian that goes around showing really kind of how stupid ISIS is. It's kind of like a Larry David kind of take on sort of ISIS. And it was incredibly popular. 20 million people watched per episode. That is incredibly effective, right? And ISIS hated it. They did death threats to all the actors and to all the producers at Middle East Broadcasting Corporation. But to me, we need 10 selfie programs because they're getting at the heart of it. They are directly tackling, dispelling the narrative, but doing it in a smart way that's sort of edutainment.
On this issue of counter narratives, a story from the Allentown Morning Call from earlier this month focuses on this issue. They write, now many experts in radicalization are asking a basic question, though. If you can't beat them, why not ban them? Instead of coming up with new clickable content and stories to discredit terrorist propaganda, why not make the radicals' toxic material much harder to find on the internet? Better yet, why not just remove it altogether? Quote, I'm unconvinced that counter-narratives work, said Hani Farid, a computer science professor at Dartmouth and a senior advisor to the nonprofit Counter-Extremism Project. I don't think they're harmful. I have not seen evidence, though, that they're actually effective.
Yeah. So, look, I think there's a role for censorship, and I think that a lot of the internet companies have realized, look, from their business model, they don't want this toxic stuff on their ecosystem. But I think oftentimes we overplay the role of censorship, and I'll tell you why. These groups are evolving very quickly. And they're using things, like I said earlier, of coded language. What are we going to start banning Nutella and kittens? They're now moving beyond the sort of terms of service so that they can skirt those rules. So my thing is that, look, censorship plays a role, but this is a content war. So you can keep on taking stuff down, but at the end of the day, it's about producing content that overwhelms them in this sort of freedom exchange of ideas. And that's why I think we have to think more in terms of aggregating content, distributing content, and mobilizing people on the sidelines.
Shara Muta is in Bedford, Pennsylvania, line for Democrats. Good morning.
Yes, thank you very much. I am a student at the University of Pennsylvania, and I honestly have to say, part of my week, because of stress and all, I will sit down and watch Netflix after a hard week of work. And I'm saying this because the internet, after the FCC neutrality rules, there might be fast lane and slow lane, I am assuming. I want to wonder what your thoughts on that, because after a week, and so, I want to sit down, put on Netflix, dim the lights, and crank the shank to Donald Trump's Big Dinas.
Shara Muta, you're going out in and out a little bit there. Did you get the question?
Yeah, I mean, I think was asking about sort of playing off what we talked about with censorship and sort of on the information battlefield. Look, I think the main thing is that in this content war, we have to mobilize young people to tell their own stories. To me, that's the key thing here, because that, things like the selfie program, things like the young Malalas, these organic, authentic stories, they drown out ISIS. And this is why defectors are so important. I'll also mention, you mentioned about Hani and others. Look, I've taken a data-driven approach. And the voice of women, young women, the voice of mothers, incredibly, moves the needle. I'm not talking about just behavior change. I'm talking about something that actually can stop young people from going down this path.
So you talked about the narrative. What is the medium that we send that through? Is it point-to-point contact? Is it large-scale Facebook blasts? What's the best way that works?
Well, I think oftentimes you have to think about, if you think about the customer journey and you think about audience segmentation, so oftentimes, large blasts don't work as well. I think the redirect method, what Google has done, is very, very influential because it's very targeted. It's looking at people that are already searching, that punch something into Google to sort of search for something. You already have people going along this journey. You also want to think about, where do people consume information? We're now in more echo chambers. We go to places to consume information that reinforce what our ideas are. So how do you get things onto those publications? I can blast something out on Fox News or CNN or on a TV channel, but young people may not be watching that. They're watching something else, Al Jazeera. They're watching Middle East Broadcasting Network. They're watching other things. So we have to think more carefully about how do we reach those key audiences, and what are the stories that we want to tell.
And are we doing that in the Trump administration? Did we do that in the Obama administration?
Yeah, I think there's some understanding of that, but the issue is that, like, I'll give you an example. It wasn't until this past August that our cyber command became a unified command. So
explain what that means.
That means that it became a full standing operational command within our military to originate and carry out both operational things on this information battlefield. Before they needed others' authority and that they weren't as independent. And I think now that we are coming to understand the seriousness of what to do on this information battlefield. Under the previous administration, we created the Global Engagement Center, which was the right idea, which was based at the State Department, which was an idea of it takes a network to defeat a network. But to me, it's just that we have to put more resources into this. And that's why it comes with the Manhattan Project. So the Global Engagement Center, the earlier version of it, it was funded at $5 million. Well, our military band is about $400 million. So think about that. This is time intensive, it's people intensive. Like it is a Manhattan Project. We have to think about the 1940s. We need people that are the best and brightest. We need to recruit them from the private sector and from all over, combining them with the know-how we have in government, and mobilize these young people's stories.
So I know the 2018 budget is still up in the air and we're working on continuing resolutions, but what did the Trump administration request for this specific task in their budget request?
Well, the Global Engagement Center the budget has been increasing. I think this year they're around $60 million. They've requested more money. And so to me, that's moving in the right direction. The thing, though, is that we have to work with partners, though. This is a key part of it. We can't do it ourselves. It takes a network to do network. So, I'm only as good as, for example, the Nahdlatul Ulama, which is based in Indonesia, which is one of the largest civil society groups in the world and very effective. So that is our loafers on the ground. That's our diplomats in all of our embassies and consulates. They're the ones that are able to strike those partnerships, whether it's with them, whether it's content hubs in the Middle East, like the Sawab Center. To me, that's where the real key is.
Steve's waiting in Phoenix, Arizona, line for Democrats. Good morning.
Hi, good morning, and thank you for C-SPAN. I have a kind of a two-part question. One, I hear that a lot of people get radicalized online, so it doesn't seem to matter where they're from if they can just get online. And the other one is, you mentioned the fact that before the Internet came along, they had to use cassettes and things that had to be distributed, which took longer, therefore made it even harder to spread those ideas in a timely manner. Since that is an effective strategy, how come we just don't shut down the Internet to, like, say, religions?
So, I think that a lot of my research shows that, it's the lone wolf phenomena actually doesn't play out. That's a little bit of a misnomer, that young people don't just get radicalized sitting in a basement watching videos, that they have dozens of people, oftentimes hundreds of people in touch with them, to sort of convince them, to recruit them, and to sort of get them, play on their identity grievances. And so we have to think about that sort of local radicalization, what I talk about. And again, on censorship, I'm pretty clear. It has a small role, but we can't overemphasize that. It's a content war. You can spend all your time trying to take down content, but the problem is that you're never going to be ultimately successful because they're already 3 steps ahead and thinking about content that doesn't violate those terms of service.
Just about 15 minutes left in our conversation with Haroon Ullah. The book is Digital World War, Islamists, Extremists, and the Fight for Cyber Supremacy. If you want to call in with your questions or comments, Republicans, it's 202-748-8001. Democrats, 202-748-8000. Independents, 202-748-8002. On that line for Independents is Brian in Illinois. Brian, good morning.
Hi, good morning, gentlemen. I enjoy the subject. And what I would like to comment on is, in addition to what you're discussing, all the other problems that have evolved with the internet, hacking, identity theft, on and on and on. What bothers me is the Goliaths that control the internet and make piles of money. Apple, Google, Microsoft, Bill Gates, on and on and on. These people are sitting on piles and piles of money. Why aren't these large organizations spending some of that money they're sitting on fighting extremism, fighting hate, fighting people that call for the death of other people, fighting the cyber criminals? We don't hear anything about it. I mean, they have literally between the 5 biggest companies, they're sitting on trillions of dollars of profit. What are these 5 organizations doing?
Got your point, Brian.
Yeah, so Brian, great question. They are better understanding it. And I have to say, I've seen over the years, they were slow to recognize it, but have really come to the forefront. I think Facebook had their global head of public policy, Monica Bickert, done kind of fabulous job of putting money towards programs like the peer-to-peer program to fight extremism, mobilizing young people. They recognize, as much as anybody else, from a business standpoint, it doesn't make sense for these people to be polluting their ecosystem. And so we have to continue to push them, Brian. So I think what Brian's saying is right, is that we need to continue to push the companies to put more resources into this, to think about digital dust. But we do find that they are now starting to put more money in it. And the reason is because from a business standpoint.
To Linda in Truman, Arkansas, line for Democrats. Linda, good morning.
Hi, yes, I'd like to know what the author thinks about that English bin Laden video. It was a propaganda video that stated that what they were fighting for was to overthrow white world rule, that they were tired of white people ruling the world and that they wanted equal treatment. I would like to know if that affects ISIS and if that's not what they're actually fighting over.
Right. So interestingly enough, I mean, when we look at Al-Qaeda and when I've studied ISIS, they just want a war with the West. So they want West, and they think everybody in the West is culprits, right? So they in a lot of ways, they're sort of racially neutral. I mean, they see anybody that's living in the West has sort of sold out, and they try to make them the other. And so that's the civilizational war that they want. And I'll go back to also tying back to something Brian mentioned. Look, recently in the last few months, the internet companies created something called the Global Forum for Fighting Extremism. They set up this consortium and putting money into it. All the big tech companies have contributed because they recognize, again, they need to be on the front lines of this. They can't be relying just on governments. Again, that's a step in the right direction.
Another piece from your book, The Digital World War. You write, rather than pushing Islamic parties further into the arms of extremists through policies of suppression, Western powers would be wise to exploit tensions between these groups and to look for points of shared interest with Islamic parties, interests that may well serve as the basis of dialogue and cooperation. You're suggesting working with some of these groups. Is that a dangerous thing to do? How do we trust them?
Look, oftentimes we have to make hard decisions. And I'll give you an example of a very real decision. When I was working in Pakistan, I had to make a decision. I might disagree with a religious leader or somebody on almost every point. But if they're anti-violence, anti-extremism, that they're advocating anti-Al-Qaeda, Taliban, they might be homophobic. They may not believe in the same democratic values that I do. But on the ground, I want to find a way to work with that person at least, because they're able to stop young people from joining these groups that ultimately could harm U.S. national security. And those are the tough decisions that we have to make. But I do think that we have to think about where are those points. Now, it's a gray line, and I think that's why we rely on our diplomats and our people on the front lines. But we have to. I think the hallmark of protecting U.S. national security is making those types of decisions.
So who are some of the best groups we should be looking to right now who could help with this?
Well, I think a lot of Islamist groups we have this uneasy relationship with. Whether it's the AK Party in Turkey, whether it's Jamaat Islami in Pakistan. What I'm advocating for is that we at least have dialogue to try to think about it, whether it's back channel, because oftentimes these groups are able to moderate the more extreme elements within their country, or at least they have a conduit to sort of talk those people off of the fence. And at least we have to understand where are these young people, where are the grievances coming from.
So do we have those conduits right now? Is that happening?
I think to some extent, not as much as I would personally like. I think, again, we have to kind of allow our diplomats to do that kind of work, because that is the real hard work of diplomacy. I think of diplomacy as not soft as sort of jazz concerts in Budapest, but it's really doing this kind of hard work that really protects U.S. national security.
And at what point could that backfire?
Well, it backfires if you end up supporting, enabling a group that, is able to sort of not just demonize Americans and demonize, but really that ends up sort of hurting U.S. national security, because if you enable a group that is recruiting and their sole purpose is to hurt a lot of our national security interests, then obviously it can backfire. But again, I think oftentimes we're too risk averse, because we sort of block it out, this whole segment of anybody dealing with religion. We're uncomfortable. And to me, that's where our diplomats, some of the best work they've done.
A question from Twitter as we've been having this conversation. I believe Barkway is talking about United States content. When does content become propaganda?
Well, when you think about it, let's say you take it from ISIS, content becomes propaganda in terms of what the aim is. And the aim is oftentimes to convince people, to confuse people. As I said early on, when I used to interview defectors, they give me the one-word answer. Propaganda was to drive them oftentimes to do something that they knew wasn't authentic, but to get them to buy a ticket to come visit. And oftentimes they lured them there, and then they gave them jobs as janitors. And so again, young people by that time was too late. And so that propaganda is something that's been a hallmark for ISIS.
How do we get them to see what we're putting out as content, as a different way of living, and not just as U.S. propaganda?
So you have to have, messengers are important. We talked about this. Key influencers are important. Thinking about where do people get their information from. And there's tons of people that are willing to be key influencers, people in civil society, religious leaders, community leaders, women that are leading groups in different areas. I mean, there's people on the front lines, and we have to think about those partnerships, because again, it takes a network to defeat a network.
Time for a few more calls. Don is in Manning, South Carolina, line for Republicans. Don, good morning.
Good morning.
Morning,
I would like to ask, when we left the Iraqi war, did we leave the encryption devices with Iraq, and did ISIS get a hold of those? And do we have any way of detecting if they use those?
Well, Don, look, that's a really good point about encryption. They, very simply, ISIS recruits people with technical backgrounds. They're recruiting engineers, and they're recruiting young people that are coders and that have access to it and build these programs and build the infrastructure.
Who's an example of somebody that you met that happened to?
I met a young person, Rahim, in Dubai, that was recruited by ISIS and came back to the region. He had gone to university. He was IT specialist, was a coder and technology person. And they recruit young people with these backgrounds so that they can use these new apps. And by the way, these apps, we're talking about Twitter and Facebook, but they've moved on. They're using things like Saraha, which a lot of people don't know, but now is the faster it has more downloads than Snapchat in 25 countries. And so they're using new apps, again, that are more sophisticated and that provide them a different platform.
And explain what those different platforms are. What are they doing that people aren't seeing from Facebook or Snapchat?
So Saraha was actually designed by a Saudi entrepreneur, young person, which was to give honest workplace feedback. So it was almost like a version of your old, high school bulletin board, when we were growing up. So people to put things on anonymously to say, hey, don't wear pink shirts, or don't wear ripped jeans. But what happened is that the app became a form for bullying, and now ISIS and others, Tahrir al-Sham, use it for recruiting, because they find out that you can actually target vulnerable youth. So the design was very different, but the way it's being used, the same with Twitter and Facebook.
Don is in Manning, South Carolina, line for Republicans. Good morning.
Yes, and the Stuxnet, did it have anything to do with maybe us possibly going to war with Iran?
Well, I mean, the one thing that we find is that the Iranians are very good at propaganda, and so they're put out a lot of the using various outlets and proxies to put out propaganda. And again, part of it is us mobilizing in this Manhattan Project. How can we be smart to think about some of that propaganda, and how can we be sort of ahead of it?
To Jeff, Laytonville, California, line for Independence. Go ahead.
Yeah, good morning. I came in a little late, so I didn't get your
say, educational background, and I'm very interested whether you have an intelligence background as well. Thank you.
Thanks, Jeff. Well, you know, I teach at Georgetown. I did my doctoral work in political economy, game theory. I was a senior fellow at Harvard there for many years, did my graduate degree there. You know, I don't have an intel background, but I served, you know, sort of shoulder to shoulder with a lot of our intel officers when I was at the embassy in Islamabad, the U.S. Embassy, and the U.S. Embassy in Kabul. I worked with our special forces there. And so, you know, that's where my perspective comes from. I think of myself as a field person. I don't think of myself as, look, the best work, and I look at myself as not being done from D.C. The best work is out in the field. And that's the people we need to enable.
And is that something you're going to continue in your work as a Chief Strategy Officer at the Broadcasting Board of Governors?
Absolutely. And that's why I think Broadcasting Board of Governors is kind of this fantastic platform, because they're out there telling stories. There's over 2,600 affiliates all over the world. We're partnering with not just TV stations and radio, but with digital platforms to tell America's story and to be at the tip of that spear.
Time for just a few more questions. Richard has been waiting in Malden, Massachusetts. Line for Democrats. Go ahead.
Hello.
Hey, Richard. Good morning.
Yeah. The problem here with the violence, extremism, and the terrorism is all brought on by this country. We go over there. We've been over there since World War II, and we have killed more people over there. And the woman that called up, a few callers back, said about the white world taking them over. That's why we got an embassy over there in Iraq, bigger than Vatican City. We're infested with CIA over there. We're infested with contractors, which is soldiers of fortune.
So Richard, what's your question?
My question is, that's why we're being bombed. That's why we're being attacked, because they're coming. We're over there pushing them around. They're going to push us back. And until we move out, get out of there, and come back, and then if they come after us, then we got a legit thing. But we are the problem.
Got your point, Richard. Haroon Ullah, your thoughts?
Look, at the end of the day, you know, I think it's about understanding the narratives, understanding the grievances. That's why defector stories are so important. And that's, I think, what is part of what Richard's getting at, is that, look, we do have to understand. I think it's easy to otherize and to demonize. And this is the interesting thing I found about ISIS, that they direct a lot of their most gruesome content in English, right? So these young people that were telling me trust and belonging, they weren't looking at beheadings. They were looking at ISIS members handing out candy to people at circuses, or ISIS talking about rooting out corruption or governance. So ISIS, 80% of their messaging, for example, in Arabic is positive. So they're using the scary, bloody, gory, horrific stuff to do what? To scare me and you in English.
David, waiting in Los Angeles, California, line for Independence. Last caller.
Okay, I would like for you to give me just a second or two here, because what you have out here is, I believe, a lot of Islamophobia. And he is pretty much contributing to it, and it's a granted that all of what he is saying for this is, propaganda and his take on everything is from a granted point of view that Islam equates with terrorism. This identity grievance stuff, and it makes it where anybody who's a Muslim who has a grievance, a true and natural grievance, as one of your callers pointed out, about the things of the American foreign policy, then they are suspect if they go online and pronounce some of these grievances, things that tags them. So what I'm suggesting to this guy is that what he is doing is perpetuating Islamic phobia and making it where Muslims do not have freedom of speech.
Got your point, Haroon Ullah. Is that what you're trying to do?
No, absolutely not. Actually, I fully agree with what you said, because I actually, in my research, shows that Islamophobia contributes to supporting ISIS, that actually they use those narratives. So they pick up what Islamophobes are using, use it in their propaganda to try to do this civilizational war. And I think, you know, we need to tell the stories of, you know, part of what I've found in my work is the stories of American Muslims serving in the military, as teachers, as doctors, as engineers, as been here for hundreds of years. Those stories are incredibly powerful, because when you read ISIS propaganda, they'll say things like, oh, there's no mosques in the U.S. I mean, there's more mosques in the U.S. than most places in the world because of freedom of religion, freedom of speech. So Thomas Jefferson, had a copy of the Quran. Those are the type of stories that we need to be telling people because that's an integral fabric of who we are, and that actually directly tackles their core thesis. So I actually agree exactly what you said, and that's a big part of my own work.
The book is Digital World War, Islamists, Extremists, and the Fight for Cyber Supremacy. The author, Haroon Ullah. Thanks so much for your time this morning.
Thanks for having me.
And in our next segment of the Washington Journal, we're going to return to this question that we talked about at the beginning of our program, asking you for your political winners and losers of the past 12 months. Lines for Republicans, Democrats, and independents. You can start calling in now. As we show you this week on Newsmakers, we sat down with billionaire Democratic donor Tom Steyer, who launched a campaign to impeach President Trump. During the interview, which airs in full on Sunday at 10 a.m. and 6 p.m., he addressed some of the criticisms he's received from Democrats over his efforts.
Some quotes from Democratic leaders don't suggest timing, but something other. For example, I wrote down a comment, unhelpful, a vanity project, futile. When you hear those kinds of critiques of your effort, what are you hearing?
Well, I hear two different things. I hear one, that it's not good timing, which I was talking about before. And the other one, I hear a question about